Thank you. Any questions for staff? Representative Goodman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Roger Goodman from the 45th District and a fellow member of this committee. It's a great honor to bring this bill before you again. This is a bill that passed the House last time around. And I dare say that sexual assault victims experience even more trauma than domestic violence victims. And yet they are the only victims and survivors that have to go back to the court every 2 years to face their predator and suffer the trauma over and over again. Domestic violence protection orders are under law able to be issued permanently, as are stalking orders. And so this bill would bring sexual assault protection orders in line with what we allow now for domestic violence and stalking. It doesn't have to be permanent, but case by case, the court could order a permanent order. And then the respondent could at any time come back and seek to alter or remove the order as well. I'd be happy to add language to this bill to make that clear, because that language actually is in the domestic violence statute. And I wanted to address, if you're not going to ask me, the firearms issue. The bill that we passed a couple of years ago, providing a process by which firearms rights are suspended during the pendency of a protection order, do apply to this. But again, a domestic violence order today could be permanent, and that was agreed to 2 years ago, that firearms rights would be suspended for someone subject to a permanent domestic violence protection order. I can give you some statistics about what's happening with sexual assault protection orders as compared with domestic violence protection orders. Very, very few sexual assaults are committed with firearms. It's a different type of crime. I believe of the 170 or almost 180 petitions in King County in the last couple of years, about 65 or 70 have been granted, and of those, only 13 had firearms rights suspended. 10 of those involved victims under the age of 16. So those are particularly serious cases where the court made a finding, and that was a requirement that we put in, a separate finding that the respondent is a credible threat to the petitioner. So we're providing the protection for the victims, and hopefully we can work this out.
Representative Rodney has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate your testimony, Representative Goodman. You just said something that I think is interesting, that in the data that we're receiving, you mentioned that these types of orders, it's very rare that the perpetrator would use a weapon that would form the basis for the issuance of this type of order. Would you be willing to entertain language that would provide a clear nexus between the use of a firearm to justify the potential permanent restriction of firearms rights in this context?
We'll have to take a look at the language, of course, but I guess I'll just leave it at that. I want to work this out so that we're protecting the rights of law-abiding firearms owners, but really protecting victims and survivors.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone wants to, that's not debatable. I mean, everyone wants to offer that protection, provide that protection. We're trying to strike a delicate balance here.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Thank you, Representative Goodman. Let's open this up for public testimony.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. With that, would Andrea Piper-Wentland, David Ward, Mary Ellen Stone, and Cali Knox please come forward and join us for testimony? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair and Committee. For the record, my name is Andrea Piper-Wentland, and I'm the Executive Director with the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. WCSAP is a membership organization that supports 39-plus sexual assault response centers, also known as rape crisis centers, throughout the state. These programs are in every county of the state and collectively serve approximately 13,000 individuals impacted by sexual violence a year. This is a priority bill for the coalition to improve protection for sexual assault survivors, as we have seen the impact of limited duration SAPO orders to victims across our entire state. We brought this bill forward in the last 2 years, and in 2016 it passed the Senate unanimously, but died in the House during the last week of the legislative session due to unrelated firearms concerns raised by the NRA. We bring this bill back forward to you again this year to promote equity of protection for all crime victims in Washington state and to improve accessibility and protection for sexual assault victims. Current statute only allows sexual assault protection orders to be issued for up to 2 years. This bill will align protections with those for domestic violence, stalking, and harassment victims by allowing an order to be issued for more than 2 years. For many victims, as you can imagine, 2 years is an inadequate time. The risk posed and fear of harm remain after the original period of protection. When an order is set for a fixed time, victims must reapply for the order and appear back in court. This is cumbersome, can re-traumatize victims, and deter them from seeking legal protection.
Go ahead and wrap up.
Okay, thank you. I want to stress that nothing in this bill changes the criteria for obtaining an order of our existing firearm rights. It simply improves the systems for victims and aligns the protection order with other orders in our state. We're seeing it across the state that survivors need access to orders that extend beyond 2 years, and that we should have equity across orders in our state for victims. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Who's going to go next here?
Good morning. I hope it's okay if I read this from my phone.
It is.
My name is Cali, and I'm a sexual abuse survivor. I live in Des Moines. When I was 4 years old, a family member began to sexually abuse me. The abuse took place in Pierce County. He emotionally terrorized me, as well as physically and sexually abusing me. He would abuse another family member in front of me. He convinced me that he was always watching me to make sure I never told. And he threatened to kill my family if I were to tell. The abuse went on for over a year before I finally got the courage to tell my parents. After I told, I lived in fear for years. I became violent towards my family. My parents got me counseling and gave up their jobs to stay at home and help me recover. They made a police report, but the file got lost. Working through this has been a lifelong journey, and I still struggle with anxiety from the abuse. In 2015, my parents told me that my abuser had moved only a few blocks from my house. I was 17 years old and was just gaining a sense of independence, but knowing that my abuser lived so close to me made me feel scared. When I heard about the option for a protection order, it gave me hope. I was anxious about facing my abuser in court and having all the memories flood back. I was especially afraid because I didn't want him to see me weak. The first time I went to court, the judge denied my order. He said too much time had gone by and that it wasn't necessary for me to get the order. I felt crushed. 2 weeks later, KCSARC got us in touch with a lawyer who wrote a letter to the judge asking him to change his mind. I went back to court and my order was granted that time. I was relieved to have something that might prevent my abuser from harming me. A few weeks ago, I went to court again to get the order renewed. I was afraid of seeing my abuser again, and my family was stressed leading up to the court date. I was glad when he didn't show up, but it was still a very tough experience. It's hard to think about having to go back every 2 years. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you'll pass this law. It would mean so much to me and many other survivors. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Cali, before we go on, I just do want to say I think everyone on this committee recognizes how hard it is to be a survivor and to not just to go to court, but then to come here and testify in a public hearing. So I just want to thank you for doing that. We recognize how challenging it is. So thank you. Which one of you wants to go next?
Mary Ellen Stone, King County Sexual Assault Resource Center. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to testify today. King County Sexual Assault Resource Center is a primary provider of sexual assault services. We respond to about 3,000 victims a year throughout the King County area. You heard how hard it is for victims to come forward. The Sexual Assault Protection Order bill is simply a stay-away bill that requires the respondent to stay away from the victim. Representative Goodman spoke to the statistics that we're seeing in King County. We can certainly get you more information about that. But I want to underscore that the SAPO is not an easy process to go forward to get. And going back to a courtroom, a public setting, in front of a judge, every 2 years, providing graphic information, graphic details about what happened is challenging at best. And I want to say that the impact of this is significant. I mean, you heard Cali, you hear the stress and the fear that people experience. What we want to do is make sure that victims of sexual assault get the protection that they deserve, have access to the laws that are designed to protect them, and restore their faith in a system that we really encourage them to come forward and to speak out. The bill that we're proposing gives victims like Cali the same protection that victims of victims of domestic violence, of stalking, of harassment get right now. And we are strongly urging you to pass this bill to give victims of rape the same protection that other crime victims currently have. Thank you.
David.
Thank you, Chair Jenkins and members of the committee. My name is David Ward. I'm an attorney at Legal Voice, an organization that works to advance women's rights in the Northwest. And happy to be here to testify today in favor of this bill. I'd like to just address some issues that may have arisen over firearms restrictions in this legislation. As prior folks have pointed out, sexual assault protection orders are not granted easily, and firearms restrictions in our experiences are entered very rarely in these types of cases. In 2 years in King County where protection orders were tracked, of 77 sexual assault protection orders that were granted, only 13 included firearms restrictions. And the standard for issuing firearms restrictions in sexual assault protection order cases are pretty stringent. And I think it is important to point out that the legislation Representative Goodman sponsored in 2014, when you read it closely, there are some interesting things to note about it. And I will add that the 2014 legislation that included firearms restrictions in more domestic violence cases was endorsed and was done with the cooperation and input of the NRA. Additional firearms restrictions from that legislation only apply in certain cases involving intimate partners, domestic violence involving intimate partners. Those firearms restrictions cannot apply in SAPO cases generally, because under our statutes, you cannot get a sexual assault protection order if you are sexually assaulted by an intimate partner. In those cases, you have to get a domestic violence protection order instead. So some of the firearms restrictions that were added by Representative Goodman's bill from 2014 actually don't apply to SAPOs. And I know that's not apparent necessarily from reading the statute, but we can provide more information on that if that helps.
Great. Are there questions? Thank you all very much for your testimony. I think we have a number of people signed in not wishing to testify.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. 8 individuals in favor of this bill as follows: Nancy Sapiro, representing the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, National Council of Jewish Women; Pam Crone with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence; Lisette Cadena, City of Seattle; Larry Shannon with the State Association for Justice; Brad Tower, representing the Washington Coalition of Crime Victims Advocates; Tom McBride, representing the Washington Association of Prosecuting Attorneys; Richard Torrance with Department of Commerce; and Andrew Lagerwell, representing the Attorney General's Office. Signed in opposition to the bill, Tom Kwesiak with the National Rifle Association.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to close the hearing on House Bill 1384, open up the hearing on House Bill 1396, and hear from Edie Adams.
House Bill 1396